Ethical behavior is mandatory, but it's not always easy. As a project manager, your success can depend on your ability to identify and manage ethical issues. In this course, I'll teach you a framework to help you make ethical decisions and overcome dilemmas. We'll also tackle how to make moral decisions when working with tools like AI and social media. Hi, I'm Bob McGannon. In my 30-plus years working in the project environment, I've had to make plenty of decisions, and I didn't always make the right ones, which means I've learned a lot. So join me and let's work through ethics management tools together. Frequently, ethics guidelines are written as black and white rules. The Project Management Institute, or PMI's guidelines for project managers, sometimes do as well. Unfortunately, reality often presents us with shades of gray. Sometimes we face competing ethical guidelines, and we need to make difficult decisions. Here's a story that describes a couple of these competing guidelines. In the videos that follow, we'll examine PMI's 4 ethical values and how they can be applied to this story. John is a project manager in a consumer electronics company. He's responsible for overseeing the development of new products. This includes design, engineering, and production. John focuses on being ethical and always looks to follow the rules. One day, he had an opportunity to purchase a critical component for a new project at a 20% discount. This was a significant cost saving which would never been offered previously, providing much-needed relief to the project budget. However, John didn't have the financial authority to approve the purchase, and he couldn't reach a manager who did. He knew that if he did not act immediately, the savings opportunity would be lost. John faced a dilemma. He knew he wasn't supposed to authorize purchases beyond his financial authority, yet his job responsibilities clearly called for him to save money when executing his projects. He was unsure what to do. He saw gray. John's ethical dilemmas aren't uncommon. Many project managers often face this type of ethical conflict. The key is to have a sound model to work through these ethical dilemmas. PMI's 4 ethical values, responsibility, respect, fairness, and honesty, can help. In the following videos, we'll shine the spotlight on John's dilemma and apply these values to help address these ethical conflicts. Project management isn't a passive role. We need to constantly make decisions and own the results. Maybe we should wear Post-it notes saying, "That decision was mine." PMI requires project managers to take ownership of their actions or lack of action, decisions or lack thereof, and outcomes. That's it. It's quite straightforward. If you consistently behave as if you own what you do or don't do, you're satisfying your responsibility requirement. And you'll likely be viewed as a high-integrity project manager by your managers and peers. However, even though this approach is straightforward, it doesn't mean it's easy to implement. A story in the opening video in this chapter provides us with a bit of a dilemma. John, the project manager, has an opportunity to purchase a critical component for a new project at significant cost savings. This would provide much-needed budget relief. However, John has no financial authority to approve the purchase, and a decision needs to be made. He owns the responsibility to follow organizational policies. He also owns the responsibility to seek and engage ways to save his company money when it comes to the project he's managing. It doesn't appear he can do both. If he approves the purchase, he violates his financial approval limit. If he doesn't approve the purchase, he misses a great opportunity to save his company money. So, what should he do? Let's look at the 3 elements of responsibility ownership to evaluate this. Up first is decision-making. In John's circumstance, not making a decision is a decision to bypass the potential savings. It's recommended that John be decisive about what he does, either pursue the cost savings or not. Now let's examine acting or not. In this case, it's directly related to decision making. John should consider other managers he might reach in the required time frame to give him guidance. He might also look for instances in his corporate project files to determine what his business would prefer he do. In short, he should take action to determine the approach his business would want him to take. Finally, there's the outcome to examine. John should seek to learn from this situation and understand the outcome his business would prefer. Does he comply with the rules and not violate his financial decision-making authority, or does he approve the purchase, saving his company money? Either way, there's one thing John needs to do. That's to acknowledge he made a decision. He shouldn't blame that situation on anyone else, such as his manager he couldn't reach. He should accept the resulting outcome. So, what's the right decision for John to make? It depends on his business and what they would prefer he do. What we can learn from this is to be proactive. Talk to your sponsor about the rules and understand how hard and fast they are. Some rules may be treated as guidelines. Would the outcome of saving money outweigh the financial authority rule in your business? Best to find out. One thing is certain, however. If you're in this situation, there's one thing you absolutely should do. Make a decision and wear it. Psychologist and best-selling author Harriet B. Breaker said, "Conflict can and should be handled constructively. When it is, relationships benefit." Embracing the ethical value of respect gives us the opportunity to manage conflicts, maintain ethics, and enhance our relationships. Let's talk about how that can occur. PMI's definition of the respect value is a duty to show a high regard for ourselves, others, and the resources entrusted to us. PMI's mandatory standards include negotiating in good faith, not using our expertise or position to influence others to benefit personally at their expense, not acting in an abusive manner towards others, and respecting the property rights of others. Let's apply the PMI definition of respect to John's scenario regarding making a heavily discounted purchase outside his level of financial authority. For John to be trusted, he needs to demonstrate his willingness to adhere to his financial delegation limits. However, to achieve performance excellence, he would need to make the purchase to save the company money. These two elements are at odds with each other. The tricky part is bringing this all together in mutual cooperation. As John is unable to reach a manager with the necessary financial delegation authority, John needs to proceed on his own. To embrace mutual cooperation, John might want to seek another solution. Is it possible a smaller purchase could be made that's within his financial delegation to enable some savings for his company? If this approach is applied, John can be trusted within his financial delegation authority while also embracing performance excellence. After this transaction is complete, it's possible his financial delegation could be increased to provide more flexibility with future purchases. Another approach to negotiate would be to request an extension of the sale price deadline, but with a smaller discount. This would enable John to stay within his financial delegation and still provide some savings for the company. By closely examining and applying the respect value, you can feel confident you are employing ethical behavior on your projects, and, quite possibly, enhancing your relationships as well, as you'll be perceived as supporting your business and their rules and regulations. I once interviewed for a job at a new company. I was excited about the role, but I didn't get the job. After asking for feedback from the interviewing manager, he told me I came in second to a candidate that was already in their business. It was very disappointing because nowhere in their job posting did they list that internal experience was an evaluation point. Now, I totally get it. I probably wasn't the best candidate, and the right business decision was made. But given the detail in the job posting, how the decision was ultimately made didn't seem fair. Fairness. The third value of the PMI Code of Ethics requires perspective taking. What I believe to be fair, someone else may not, like in my interview story. To overcome this as project managers, we need to be transparent in our decision-making process and the actions we take. According to PMI, fairness is our duty to make decisions and act impartially and objectively. Our conduct must be free from competing self-interest, prejudice, and favoritism. There are two primary considerations with fairness: avoiding conflict of interest situations and avoiding favoritism and discrimination. In our case study scenario I shared at the beginning of this chapter, conflict of interest examples would include disclosing any real or potential conflicts of interest with the vendor. For instance, is the vendor a distant relative, or is John a shareholder of the vendor? It's always best to share potential conflicts with management and let them determine if a conflict of interest exists. If one does exist, then someone else should work with the vendor when making decisions. Most importantly, if you don't think you can be impartial to a situation, ask for someone else to fulfill your role to avoid a perceived conflict of interest. Favoritism and discrimination are another aspect of fairness. In John's scenario, he should ensure he works with 2 or 3 vendors to obtain quotes and select the vendor that provided the best value for money. The selection process should be void of nepotism, bribery, and personal considerations or preferences. Most organizations have a discrimination policy which should be followed during the day-to-day project management activities. When in doubt, ask someone for advice. You could also ensure your team is aware of the discrimination policy. Discrimination can seep into our everyday actions if we're not aware of the nuances of discrimination. It's easy to assume you think you're being fair. However, be aware of how your actions could be perceived. You don't want to leave an impression that things weren't fair, even if you aren't interviewing people for a new job. Honesty is the fourth and final ethical value in the PMI Code of Ethics. As project managers, we share information every day, and it's essential that we communicate and act with honesty as we interact with various stakeholders. Your reputation and credibility depend upon you consistently being honest. PMI's definition of honesty is our duty to understand the truth and act in a truthful manner both in our communications and in our conduct. There are 2 components to the honesty value. 1, engaging in behavior that does not deceive others, and 2, do not engage in dishonest behavior for personal gain or at someone else's expense. Now, let's apply these honesty components to John's scenario regarding making a heavily discounted purchase outside his level of financial authority. What if John went back to the vendor and said his manager provided verbal approval for the purchase and proceeded to make the purchase? Clearly, this would not be honest and would have been misleading. Once the truth was revealed, the purchase could have been canceled by John's company, and the vendor may not want to do business with John's company again. John's reputation would be tarnished, and his company's image could be damaged as well. Honesty can be thinly veiled and sometimes hard to identify. What if John said nothing to the vendor and simply approved the purchase on the spot? In this scenario, John withheld the fact that he did not have the authority to approve the purchase. This isn't fully honest, as it gives the impression that it is different from the truth. Dishonesty includes withholding information, misleading and false statements, half-truths, and providing information out of context. The bottom line is, if it doesn't seem right, it probably isn't. Being honest can mean things will take longer to get processed, approved, or actioned. Therefore, on occasion, it may be tempting to not be honest, so things are fast-tracked. But this can catch up to you and damage your reputation. Consistently being honest makes it easier to interact with all your stakeholders as they will trust you to be transparent. Keep in mind, if you're dishonest just once, your reputation and credibility can be greatly tarnished. If you always take the honest high road, your job will be easier in the long run, and you could sleep at night knowing you did the right thing. Should you ever be tempted to compromise honesty, I think James Altucher provides us with great advice. Altucher is an American hedge fund manager, podcaster, and entrepreneur who's launched over 20 companies. He said, "Honesty is the fastest way to prevent a mistake from turning into a failure." One final note. As a means of reviewing all of PMI's mandatory ethical values, I have included a mandatory ethics checklist in the exercise files. The ethics code PMI has provided to project managers includes aspirational standards. These are standards that we endeavor to uphold in our dealings as project professionals. As the PMI Code of Ethics describes them, aspirational standards establish expectations we have of ourselves as individuals. They're not optional. We always need to strive to meet these aspirational expectations, though it is accepted that adherence is hard to measure and we might not always meet them. Given that, it's appropriate that we take a look into another ethical scenario. Let me introduce you to Chad. Chad was sent a confidential report that could help him justify a project he was working on. The report contained data that showed how the project would improve productivity and increase profits. However, the report also included personal performance data that could compromise multiple employees in the company. Chad had 3 facts to consider. First, he was unsure whether the report should even have been shared with him. Second, he definitely did not want to compromise employee privacy. And third, his managers were desperately looking for him to find ways to justify the project, and this report would solve that problem. As we see, Chad is faced with competing objectives and found himself unsure how to proceed. In the next set of videos, we'll review Chad's situation against the aspirational standards for behavior PMI has included in its Code of Ethics. In the PMI Code of Ethics, each described behavior has mandatory standards and a set of aspirational standards we should seek to uphold. Let's examine PMI's aspirational standards for responsibility. The aspirational objectives are broader than the required standards. PMI's aspirational standards for responsibility are to make decisions in the best interest of society, only accept assignments that are appropriate for our skills, always do what we say we will do, take ownership of errors or omissions we make, protect confidential information, and hold ourselves and others accountable to the Code of Ethics. If you believe embracing these aspirational objectives is easy, think again. For example, I've encountered many instances where I was asked to manage a project outside my area of expertise. While I brought significant project management experience to the table, the project business context was totally outside my area of expertise. An open discussion about my experience when asked to participate in a project is important and sometimes uncomfortable. Chad, the project manager in our scenarios, has uncomfortable challenges as well. In the scenario presented to start this chapter, Chad is looking to justify a project and has a report that could help. However, that report contains confidential personnel information, and Chad has doubts about whether the report should have been shared with him. One thing jumps out immediately, and this is Chad's doubts about whether he should have the report. Accepting that report was an error of judgment, and he should acknowledge that if he's to act within the aspirational standards of responsibility. His having that report also represents a lack of protection of confidential information. He should consider discarding the report and try other ways of justifying his project. Alternatively, assuming his project sponsor has the authority to view the report's confidential information, Chad could consider another action. In the interest of transparency and taking ownership, he could share the report with his sponsor, taking responsibility for having a report he probably shouldn't have seen. Based on that, they can have a candid and open conversation about whether the report could be used to justify the project they're trying to launch. Potentially, this might be done in a way that won't expose the personnel information included in the report. Openness, transparency, and taking ownership always sound easy, but in the face of real-world situations, can be challenging. We need to be ready to live up to our responsibilities at any time and take comfort in the fact that ethical behavior is the basis for our personal integrity. In a prior video, we discussed the PMI mandatory standards for the RESPECT ethical value. Now, let's discuss the approaches you can take to demonstrate aspirational levels of respect on your project so you can elevate your ethical behavior. PMI's aspirational standards for respect are: understand the norms and customs of others, listen to others' points of view, directly approach someone with whom you have a conflict, and conduct yourself in a professional manner. To bring these standards to life, I consider the following questions. Do you avoid behaviors that could be considered disrespectful? Do you listen to others and seek to understand their perspective? Do you act professionally even when someone else doesn't? Do you avoid engaging in gossip? And do you avoid making negative comments to undermine someone else? To achieve aspirational standards of respect, all these questions need to be answered with a confident yes. Let's apply Chad's scenario to the aspirational standards for respect. Remember, Chad is seeking to justify a project and has a report that could help. However, that report contains confidential personnel information, and Chad doubts whether the report should even have been shared with him. Let's apply the questions I just shared to Chad's situation. The first question asks if behaviors would be considered disrespectful. Certainly, if the report's personnel contents are shared, it would be disrespectful. Either the report should not be used to justify the project, or the confidential information should be removed. Listening to others' perspective is the essence of the second question. It's impractical to seek the perspective of the personnel whose confidential information is in the report. Chad's being open and sharing the report with his manager is a valid approach. His manager could provide a perspective on whether or not to go forward and use the report to justify the project. In this scenario, the third question about acting professionally, the fourth question about not engaging in gossip, and the last question about not sharing negative comments are closely related. Under no circumstances should Chad ever share any personnel information from the report. To do so would be unprofessional, qualify as gossip, and compromise Chad's integrity. This type of scenario isn't uncommon. I recall one time I had access to salary bonus data for the whole company. I was shocked when I saw some of those bonuses. I quickly realized that I'd have to behave like I'd never seen the information. I wanted to ensure I didn't treat people differently based on what I'd seen. It's hard to do, but it's essential so we can do our jobs and respect others. As you can see, acting with respect can be challenging. Sometimes it may be easier to look the other way. However, to achieve the PMI aspirational standards for respect, we need to do the right thing and act definitively when things don't seem quite right. Fairness is a crucial part of ethical behavior. In a prior video, we discussed the PMI mandatory standards for the fairness ethical value. Now, let's discuss the approaches you can take to demonstrate aspirational levels of fairness on your project. The key here? Fairness is more than just treating everyone equally. The PMI aspirational standards for fairness are: demonstrate transparency in the decision-making process, constantly re-examine our impartiality and objectivity, provide equal access to information to those who are authorized, and make opportunities equally available to qualified candidates. Let's apply the scenario with Chad to the aspirational standards for fairness. Remember, Chad is seeking to justify a project and has a report that could help. However, that report contains confidential personnel information, and Chad has doubts about whether the report should have been shared with him. Chad needs to decide how to handle the contents of the report. Using the data from the report makes it likely his project will be approved. If Chad's going to use the data, he will need to reveal the source of the data, as transparency in a decision-making process is one of the key requirements of the fairness aspirational standards. Prior to completing the business case, he'd need to verify the data and inform the person who provided him the data that he will be using it to justify the project. Full end-to-end transparency is important to avoid surprises. In addition, he'd need to ensure the recipients of the business case have the authority to see the data he will be revealing. Depending upon Chad's corporate standards, this could prove to be problematic. Another question about fairness could be raised in this scenario. Is Chad being impartial and objective? Would he have discarded the report as being confidential information he wasn't entitled to if it didn't help him justify his project? We may never know this for certain, but the question is relevant. If you find impartiality and objectivity could be questioned, proceed very carefully. It would be so much easier for Chad to use the data from the report and not explain where he received the information. However, that would not support the aspirational standards of fairness for our profession. By upholding the fairness aspirational standards, Chad's reputation will be upheld, and he can go home at night knowing he handled the personnel data with integrity and fairness. The lesson here? Make sure you understand your organizational standards for data and information sharing. It's crucial if you are to uphold PMI's aspirational standards for fairness. Former U.S. President John F. Kennedy said, "I'm interested in two things. I'm interested in truth, and I'm interested in fairness." PMI's aspirational level of honesty involves pursuing truth beyond what you currently know. Let's discuss techniques to expand the truth you understand about yourself and your project. The PMI aspirational standards for honesty are: seek to understand the truth, provide accurate information in a timely manner, and be truthful in your communications and conduct. Some actions that demonstrate honesty, ethical behavior include ensuring information presented is accurate, reliable, and timely. Courageously sharing bad news, even when it may be poorly received. Avoid taking credit for others' achievements, and avoid burying information or shifting blame to others when outcomes are negative. Let's apply Chad's scenario to the aspirational standards for honesty. Remember, Chad is seeking to justify a project, and he has a report that could help. However, that report contains confidential personnel information, and Chad has doubts about whether the report should even been shared with him. Chad could well decide to not use the report to justify the project, as the information is too sensitive to share, and he wasn't supposed to see the personnel information. While ultimately it might mean the project isn't approved, it could well be the right thing, both honest and truthful, to the protection of confidential information. Chad will have to be prepared for the project to not be approved. Chad should not get frustrated and blame others for this decision. By blaming others, Chad would not be demonstrating aspirational honesty. An appropriate response would be to thank those that helped him put the business case together and suggest they try again when they have more information to justify the project. Alternatively, Chad could share with management that he'd seen confidential personnel information that would have strengthened his position to justify the project. He can reflect honesty by sharing that he didn't feel comfortable including the highly sensitive data as he was not able to verify the data and it was labeled confidential. Chad can confirm his belief that the project is necessary and would benefit the company. Sharing that this information existed could trigger one of the project's steering committee members to pursue project justification. Ethically, Chad could make a decision himself. He could also defer the decision to the steering committee. Passing an ethical quandary to someone else isn't always the high road to take, however. If Chad's corporate rules dictate that the report shouldn't be used to justify the project, then he should ignore the report. That would be, as John F. Kennedy said, the fair and truthful alternative. One final note. As a means of reviewing all of PMI's aspirational ethical values, I've included an aspirational ethics checklist in the exercise files. While I'm shockingly bad when it comes to using tools and making house repairs, there's one saying for that industry that suits me well in many situations. That is, measure twice, cut once. That phrase reminds us to make sure we've done what we need to do accurately before taking an action we can't undo. That's a perfect way to describe ethical decision-making. In line with this thinking, PMI has provided us with an ethical decision-making model. It guides us through a series of research, like taking measurements, before making decisions. The model recommends 5 steps. They are 1. Assess the facts. 2. Consider alternatives. 3. Make and evaluate your initial decision. 4. Apply PMI's ethics. And finally, 5. Decide. Let's look briefly at each of these steps. First, you assess the facts you have against the ethics of your business and your personal views. The culture of your country, your local environment's norms, and evaluating the law may also be relevant, so consider those as well. Given those facts, you move to the second step. Consider alternatives. This is the time for due diligence. Derive alternative actions and evaluate the pros and cons of each alternative. Next, make and evaluate your initial decision. Examine the positive and negative implications of that decision on the project, stakeholders, and your organization as a whole. Look at the situation today and how that decision might impact things a year from now. Assess your objectivity and fairness. Focus on anything that may be influencing your decision and ensure they are appropriate influencers and not the result of bias or personal preference. After that evaluation, return to ethics and apply PMI's ethical standards. Remember, measure twice. Ensure your decision is suitable against PMI's ethical values of responsibility, respect, fairness, and honesty. Then, the last recommended step, decide on the best option. Share your decision openly and take ownership of the decision you have made. When appropriate, review that decision with your sponsor and stakeholders before taking action. By the way, in the interest of measuring twice, I recommend going through all these steps twice for crucial or emotionally charged decisions. You may just find other ethical implications or business possibilities that will help you in the long run. Finally, in case you're wondering, I always hire an expert to perform house repairs at my place. It's the best ethical decision I can make for me and my family because I clearly don't have the expertise to take on such a role. Technology is fantastic. I'm always fascinated with how new tech expands our capabilities and increases our efficiency. However, new technology can come with an unwanted partner, like an ethical trap or two. Rabbi and UK House of Lords member Jonathan Sachs said, "Technology gives us power, but it does not and cannot tell us how to use that power." Is he ever right with that observation? Laws concerning the use of artificial intelligence chatbots are surfacing around the world as we're producing this course. AI chatbots have access to a large volume of websites and books. It draws information from these sources. So while the query you enter into an AI chatbot may be original, the output it generates are drawn from the works of others. The ethical question this surfaces is leading to a fundamental shift in how copyright law operates and a reimagining of who or what can be classed as an author and owner of copyright. This certainly raises an ethical question and surfaces an ethical temptation for project managers. While playing with an AI chatbot, I asked it to generate a project plan for an email migration project. What it came up with was impressive. Generic, but impressive. It would form a nice table of contents and structure for a project plan, and a temptation to an inexperienced PM to submit it as their own original project plan for the project. Do I recommend you use a chatbot-generated project plan verbatim? No, and absolutely no. It could help give you some ideas, however, if heavily modified and customized for your particular project and environment. To demonstrate this point, I've included my query and the resulting project plan in the exercise files. Do I share this so you can directly use the output from a chatbot? Once again, no. Oh, and one more consideration. What you enter in an AI chatbot query can become public and be used by an AI chatbot in the future. Keep your corporate confidential data off these platforms, or you may find you have another ethical challenge on your hands. Applying the use of AI chatbot output as your own work fails very quickly when scrutinized using PMI's ethical decision-making model. First, you can't confirm the facts, as any references that current chatbots produce are often bogus. It also fails the ethical standards of honesty, fairness, and responsibility. Using chatbot output literally isn't an honest representation of your personal work, is unfair to the authors whose work the chatbot quoted, and is likely irresponsible as it will not be customized for your particular project and environment. There are some benefits to using AI chatbots, but use the information cautiously as a starting point to develop your own project artifacts. The American author Mark Twain said, "Data is like garbage. You better know what you're going to do with it before you collect it." While he was striving for humor, he was correct, but he missed something. You need to understand what you will do with data and what you won't do with it. Let's look at a scenario to explore the ethics of managing data and analytics. Lisa is managing a program for her rapidly growing organization. Her company purchased 2 other companies about a year ago. They have finally gotten around to consolidating data from her company and the 2 purchased companies into a single data repository. Lisa is focusing on data related to benefits, particularly retirement funds. Each company had different policies for these benefits, and Lisa's company decided to create one policy for all employees. That policy has been agreed and shared with all the employees. So, it's Lisa's job to apply the new benefits policy as she merges the data into one platform. As Lisa's team is analyzing the data, they see some anomalies. Things just aren't adding up. Literally. It appears the actual employee retirement balances for many employees are less than what's been reported. Her team reviewed the data multiple times to confirm the mismatch. So, Lisa held a team meeting to discuss the problem, but only with people who were already aware of the situation. She thanked them for their efforts and reminded them they need to treat the situation ethically and be respectful. They're not to share what they've discovered until management could investigate. Lisa's responsibility ethic led her to go to her manager to report the problem. Fortunately, her manager took it very seriously. He asked Lisa lots of good questions and told her to halt the data verification process until the board had an opportunity to evaluate the situation. Her manager then said, "Tell the team that the project budget has been cut. Therefore, the project is temporarily on hold." Lisa was uncomfortable about not being truthful with the team. She wanted to be respectful to management, to allow them to review the situation, and she wants to be honest and transparent with the team. However, doing so presents a challenge, as the misreported benefits information should not become public knowledge until verified. This is a very difficult situation. The key, however, is not to act contrary to an ethical standard. In this case, it means placing one ethical standard above another until the investigation is completed. Lisa told her whole team the project was on hold while the management team discussed some anomalies identified in the data verification process. This approach supported the ethical standards for respect and responsibility for the management team and the employees as a whole. Once management determined how they would correct the benefits information, the project resumed and the whole situation was openly shared, supporting the need for honesty and transparency. Catherine Bradshaw, former head of communications at the Institute of Business Ethics, made a very notable statement. Business ethics starts where the law ends, and no more so than when it comes to social media. As a relatively new technology, there is little case law, and so we must rely on our ethical values to guide us. First, let me be clear on my definition of social media. I don't mean just Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. There are other social media platforms that can be leveraged more easily in a project environment. Slack and Monday.com come to mind as examples. In a project management context, there are two primary areas of focus when it comes to ethical behavior while leveraging social media. The first is what is shared in the work environment, and second, what we share on personal social media accounts. Let's look at the work environment first. Given the frequency of working with virtual team members and the expectation for communicating quickly and transparently, social media tools are ideal. Lots of information can be shared easily and efficiently. That advantage also presents potential ethics questions. The PMI value of being transparent, alongside the need to maintain confidential and detailed financial data, can present a conflict. Sharing financial data via social media tools needs to be managed with care. In another example, documenting lessons learned for future reference on a social media tool can get tricky. You need to share the issues that surfaced and how to avoid them. Doing so meaningfully without publicly criticizing an individual or group can be difficult. Now, I understand these information sharing issues exist when you aren't using social media. But the potential for issues increase with social media tools. You have to be mindful of the ease of cut and paste activity, placing data into other platforms, statements being taken out of context, or confidential data becoming visible to people who have no need to view certain information. Extra caution is advised when sharing information on social media tools so you aren't faced with questions about your ethical behavior. Next, let's look at personal social media accounts. While we're encouraged to be authentic in today's world, what you share on social media can have a significant impact on how your company is perceived. Whether you are writing something as just a person with views or as a company employee, what you share can and will be evaluated, positively or negatively, by readers. Also, you really have no control over how people will interpret your posts. Embrace and understand the social media policy for your organization. Be mindful of what and how you share using social media platforms. Doing so is a very visible representation of where the law ends and where your personal ethics guide you. There's something just as important as your ethical behavior. It's your organization's behavior. Here's a scenario to reveal some potential ethical issues due to organizational norms. You've just started work at a new company as a project manager. This month, when reviewing the hours reported to your project, you notice something unusual. Sam, who's also new to the company, reported a 30-minute lunch each day. But you've seen him consistently take longer lunch breaks. You held a meeting with Sam, and his response really surprised you. Sam works on multiple projects, and he said that his other teammates told him it was okay to take longer lunch breaks when needed, but to only report 30 minutes because that's what everyone does. You inform Sam that's not how you manage and report time on your project, and you'd like him to report only actual time worked on your project. Sam was disappointed, but said he understood the importance of reporting time accurately. But now you have a dilemma. Do you report this? You've only been with a company a short time, so maybe this practice is typical. You decide to have a conversation with your manager, as it's your responsibility to report potential ethical issues. Your manager acknowledged that people take longer lunch breaks on occasion, but the practice is only to report 30 minutes of time off. She also said management is monitoring the situation, but they don't have any plans to address it as a problem because the work is getting done. So, does this represent unethical behavior? Probably not, but that doesn't mean there isn't a problem. If people only record part of the time they take for lunch and record the remaining lunch time against projects, we have data integrity issues. This practice produces inaccurate cost data for projects. If contracted personnel are treated the same way, then they could be charging the company for work time over and above what they actually produce for a project. Both of these situations could lead to future projects being rejected as too costly, when that might not really be the case. So what are you to do to address this? First, point out the concern to management, while understanding they may or may not decide your point of view means they should change their practice. Second, I'd produce a cost report with estimated time worked estimates, along with an explanation of why you made those adjustments. That way, your project records will reflect a more accurate cost picture for future project estimates. This allows you to behave ethically with an understanding of how your organization's practices affect your deliverable integrity. To expand your experience and understanding of ethical practices, I've included extra scenarios in the exercise files so you can further test your ethical judgment. Stephanie is struggling. She's working on an amazing project to create a product that would clearly leapfrog the competition if she could get the project funding to move forward. She's spent the last 5 weeks collecting data for the project. Most of the data she's verified is accurate, but some critical data items received from normally reliable sources she couldn't verify as accurate. Stephanie's concerned the unverified data could be misleading or false, or captured in the wrong context to properly justify her project. Her project is crucial for ensuring her company stays ahead of the game in a competitive market, but going forward with data that proves to be invalid would be very unwise. If she can't justify the project at tomorrow's Board of Directors meeting, it'll be 3 months before the board meets again. The delay in launching this project could cost the company dearly, as their competitor could put a competing product in the market, causing them to lose market share. Given how catastrophic a delay would be for the project, Stephanie is considering presenting the data without sharing that some of the data has not been validated. After all, The source of the data has always been so reliable, the data is most likely fine to use. Let's drop in on a coaching conversation I had with Stephanie. Let's move on to your project. How are you doing with the data validation?
Honestly, I wish we had more time to validate it. I really need to present this to the board, but we don't have the amount of time that we usually do to verify the data, and that makes me nervous.
What exactly makes you nervous?
Well, just, normally we do our due diligence. We verify every piece of data before we present it. That's the way we've always done it. That's the way that feels the most ethical and responsible to me. And not being able to do that is a little uncomfortable.
Yeah, okay. Speaking about ethics, and it's good that you're bringing up this discomfort. Let's look at it from a different lens, maybe as a way to help you solve the problem that you're going through. So if we take PMI's 4 values of ethics for project managers, so you've got responsibility, respect, fairness, and honesty. Let's put it in that context as a means of defining what the problem is, so maybe it gives you an opportunity to work on what the solution should be.
Okay, so in terms of honesty, that one really stands out to me. That one strikes home. It feels a little dishonest to present data that hasn't been verified. Normally, the source is very reliable, but there was one piece of data that stood out to me that I questioned. So I would want to make sure that that was really solid. If I'm being honest.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Okay, why don't we do this? Think about the problem again in those 4 contexts of the 4 values. How can you satisfy the business need and the urgency that the business might have, yet behave in an ethical manner, which kind of has these 4 values associated with it? I want you to consider some potential alternatives that you could take with the project and the board, and think about those, and we can talk again tomorrow about how you might be able to go forward.
Okay, yeah, I'll do that.
In the last video, we explored Stephanie's story. She wants to justify a time-critical project, but some of the data to justify the project isn't validated. Stephanie was considering presenting her case for justification to her board of directors without sharing that some of the data isn't validated. Her rationale for doing so is that the source of the data has always been reliable. To conclude the scenario, I asked her to consider the following questions. First, which of PMI's ethical standards are at risk if she goes forward and shares the data in her project justification pitch without mentioning that some of the data hasn't been validated? Next, I asked her to come up with 2 alternatives that she could take, should she go forward with her presentation to the board. The alternative should be in line with PMI's ethical standards and support the needs of her business. The first question is straightforward. All of PMI's ethical standards are at risk here. Holding back information about the status of her data is dishonest and shows a lack of respect for the board members. Also, it isn't fair to ask managers to make a decision without complete information. And finally, taking a risk by going forward with unvalidated data without sharing would be irresponsible of Stephanie. Next, I've thought of 3 alternatives Stephanie can take to balance her ethical standing and be a responsible steward for her business. First, she could present the information she has and be transparent about the data that isn't validated. She could ask for authorization to start the project, with data validation being the first task. If the data isn't valid, she would shut down the project. A second alternative is to explain the situation and ask for a special board meeting to review the project justification once she's had a chance to validate the data. That would cut the wait time to obtain project approval. The third alternative, if possible, is to conduct market research to determine if there is evidence that competitor companies are indeed working on a competitive product. If no evidence is present, then the 3 months wait to justify the project isn't as great a risk. These alternatives enable Stephanie to behave ethically and support the needs of the business, which fulfills her core responsibilities as a project manager. Craig was given an interesting assignment by his management team. His organization is considering managing some of their projects using agile methods, which they haven't done before. Craig has participated in a few agile projects with his last company, but didn't participate in introducing agile to his organization. Because of his experience with agile projects, he was asked to produce a report with recommendations for the steps required to introduce agile to his new organization. Craig's excited about producing this report, despite not having experience introducing agile. Based on his experience, he has some relevant views, but is sure there are things he could learn. So Craig conducts some research. His most useful information came from a query he entered into ChatGPT, asking for the top tips for starting to use agile in a business. The ChatGPT output included recommendations that validated Craig's thoughts and other new ideas that seem to make a lot of sense. As a result, Craig is considering incorporating the ChatGPT text as the core of the report he's writing to submit to his management team. Let's drop into the coaching conversation Craig and I had to discuss his plan for the ChatGPT output. So tell me about the ChatGPT output you'd like to use.
Well, I'm really excited about what it has to offer. So our team is a little unfamiliar with some of the agile frameworks that we're going to be using, and I myself am a little unfamiliar. So I took our charter, a lot of our project documentation, fed it into ChatGPT, and it provided some really excellent recommendations. And I think those could be the core of this project plan.
Okay, so considering the unfamiliarity, but what looks to be some really good output, what are the pros and cons of using that output in your report?
Well, this is where I struggle a little bit. I mean, if I think of this from PMI's honesty, if I take these recommendations, put them into the project plan, am I treating those as if I created them when really it was ChatGPT? I mean, I also think of if I ask an expert or another opinion and I put their work in, that's okay. So could I think of ChatGPT like that expert? I'm also kind of worried about the responsibility side. Do I know that what I receive from ChatGPT is actually valid? Do I know that it's not copy and pasted from someone else's report that this AI has just fed to me? So I struggle with that.
So I have an idea. Why don't you consider some alternatives? And those alternatives would minimize the ethical concerns that you've surfaced, but at the same time satisfy the business needs that you've been asked to provide and support in putting your report together. So trying to do both of those things, there are probably some options, and I think if you think through them, you might come up with something, and we can talk about it again tomorrow.
Yeah, I could do that.
In the last video, we dropped in on a conversation Craig and I had about producing a report with the recommended steps to introduce Agile to his organization. We discussed the ethical concerns that using ChatGPT output in that report would create. To conclude the session, I asked Craig what he believes he should do that would ethically support his assignment. Craig actually has a few options. Using the output from ChatGPT isn't bad if done properly. First, he should acknowledge ChatGPT as the source of his recommendations. He should also work to validate the recommendations. Using his contacts that have experience introducing Agile to their organizations would be a great approach. If that isn't an option, performing specific research to confirm the activities recommended by ChatGPT would be wise. Craig could ensure the recommendations come from reliable sources and can directly follow up with the authors should he have any questions. Finally, should executing the recommendations require skills that Craig or others in his organization don't have, he could recommend hiring an experienced Agile consultant. The consultant could guide the introduction of Agile and train Craig and his peers to handle Agile projects going forward. Francine works for a company called CB Solutions and is leading a project to evaluate, customize, and install robotics for their newest manufacturing line. The state-of-the-art line will triple CB Solutions' manufacturing capacity, which is critical to meet an increasing demand for their products. She needs to get the project implemented flawlessly to help her company achieve its growth strategy. CB Solutions has worked with robotics companies in the past and has frequently found success with RoboNow, a robotics firm that always seems to make exactly the product they need. In addition, RoboNow's post-installation support is fantastic. Nonetheless, Francine and her project team are starting their project by distributing a request for proposal, or RFP, to 4 reputable robotics companies, including RoboNow. They have created a scoring spreadsheet to evaluate each of the company's RFP responses. The evaluation criteria include the capabilities of the proposed robotics solution, the ease of customization, price of the solution, and the vendor's approach to providing ongoing support. Also included in their evaluation spreadsheet is CB Solutions' experience working with each robotics company. The evaluation criteria is being sent to each of the candidate robotics vendors as part of the RFP. Many members of the CB Solutions management team have expressed their hope that RoboNow will win the RFP evaluation process, but they've said they support the comparative scoring model process Francine and her team are taking. There are many things Francine must consider, so we're having a coaching conversation to explore them. Let's drop into that conversation. Okay, Francine, let's move on to the robotics project. Are you still concerned about the RFP?
I am a little bit concerned. We're looking at 4 companies, but I'm concerned that management is really leaning towards one specific one that we've actually worked with in the past.
Yeah, and it's not that uncommon, actually. But let me ask you a question. Have you had a conversation with the management team to say, do you even want to engage in this process at all if everybody's focused on one vendor that you've had success with in the past?
Well, yes and no. It is our standard practice to use the RFP. I do think it levels the playing field for all 4. However, we are including as criteria experience with us. So I'm actually wondering, is that unethical for us to include that experience criteria?
It's a good question. And the answer is probably yes, but it depends on how you do it.
Okay.
So having that in an RFP and having that evaluation criteria shared with everybody is ethical. The weighting factor as to what you put on it is the catch, right? So if, for instance, and let me exaggerate the point, if you put it at 90%, that was the 90% factor, you having experience with them, it becomes a fait accompli. No one else is going to come close to that score.
Right.
So it's all a matter of managing it in such a way that it is considered as a factor, but that factor is in balance with the other things that you've asked the vendors to respond to.
Okay.
So let me do this. Give you a bit of an assignment. We could talk about it tomorrow.
Sure.
Okay? Think about what you might have to watch for while you're executing the project, particularly RFP response and evaluation, to make sure it is ethical, even though it does have that experience with your company factor concluded.
Got it. Okay. That makes sense. I'll think about that and get back to you tomorrow.
In the last video, we explored the situation with Francine and CB Solutions, who are working on a project to implement robotics on their newest manufacturing line. Francine and her project team are starting their project by distributing a request for proposal, or RFP, to 4 reputable robotics companies, including a company they have frequently worked with in the past called RoboNow. At the conclusion of our discussion, I asked Francine what she should watch for to be certain the RFP evaluation process was executed ethically. Given my experience, there are 2 concerns with Francine's situation. The first is that she and her team won't actually get the opportunity to apply the scoring model objectively. Management intervention or pressure to sway the outcome would create an ethical fairness issue. This could result in conscious or unconscious bias. This decision might also hurt the company, as it's possible the best robotic solution will be bypassed in exchange for working with the company CB Solutions is most familiar with. Assuming the weighting of the experience with the vendor scoring factor is reasonable, there likely isn't a fairness concern with the approach Francine and CB Solutions are taking. Considering experience working with a vendor is a reasonable RFP scoring factor, and, importantly, CB Solutions has shared the scoring model factors with all of the robotics vendors, so they're being transparent about their evaluation criteria. Each of the vendors, knowing those scoring factors, can make an informed decision about whether to submit an RFP response. Another option to make the evaluation process equitable would be to use evaluation copies of the RFP responses for reviewers with all vendor and product names removed. Francine could also remove the experience working with the vendor from those review packages. If this approach was used, the evaluators would not know which company submitted a given RFP response. This would help ensure a fair evaluation process. Congratulations! You made it through the course. I appreciate your perseverance. There's a lot to consider when dealing with ethics, and we all need to get it right. Consider the scenarios we've reviewed together, PMI's ethical decision-making model, and your personal judgment, and you'll do fine. To help you further, I've included an ethical values checklist in the exercise files that summarizes PMI's decision-making model and ethical values. You can use this to help you in your ethical decision-making. Remember, there are more scenarios to review in the exercise files if you want to sharpen your decision-making skills against PMI's ethical values. For more perspectives, check out the Harvard Business Review article entitled 5 Principles of Data Ethics for Business. While it addresses data specifically, it will give you another great example of ethical principles for behavior in our world. Also, check out the other courses on ethics right here on LinkedIn Learning. Feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn and ask any questions you may have. You can also follow me and subscribe to my newsletter for more thoughts and tips. I wish you the best as you manage your projects successfully and ethically.